Deputy Justice Minister is embarking on consultative meetings about the possibility of decriminalizing sex work. He will be engaging stakeholders on the proposed policy and ascertain the implications of decriminalization. For more on this, I'm joined now by the Deputy Justice Minister, John Jeffries. Deputy Minister, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Talk to us about what work has been put in place to get us to this particular point where now you will be going on this consultative campaign to get input from the general public.
Okay, well, firstly, good evening, and good evening to the viewers. This issue of people selling sex work, adult prostitution, there's a variety of words attached to it, and there's no neutral meaning or no neutral term, unfortunately. But it's been something that's been ongoing for some time. The current position is that the selling and buying of sex and running brothels is criminalized under our law. However, although it's criminalized, there's not much going on in the way of prosecutions of people for selling or buying sex. Yeah, so it's there, but it's really not making any difference at all. For some time, people working as sex workers have been calling on government to decriminalize. The process was given to the South African Law Reform Commission, which took a long time doing research, but then came up in 2017 with a report that recommended the continued criminalization of the selling and buying of sex, but the diversion of people found guilty or people charged with selling sex to try and give them other skills, other training. Government didn't adopt that report, it just released it, and that's where we are currently. But what's quite clear is the existing laws are not working. There need to be changes made, and that's what we're engaging on. A lot of the issues have been with us for some time, so it's sort of, in a sense, rehashing older debates. What we did last week was to start with an engagement with the ASIGIKI coalition in particular, who are calling for the decriminalization of sex work. We would be engaging, and these are sort of small, these are not mass meetings or whatever. We would then be engaging with people who are more in support of the Scandinavian model, and then with people opposing decriminalization.
Yeah.
After that, we would take a bill to cabinet, hopefully, and that bill would then be published for public comment, which will be the more extensive public participatory process before going back to cabinet and being introduced to parliament.
There have been views that have been raised, particularly for those who are pro-decriminalization of sex work, that, for example, decriminalization would be an answer to a number of issues. One, availability or access to health services, safer working conditions, access to justice, reduced sex worker risk to HIV, challenges of stigma and discrimination, and so on and so forth. Do you believe that this one aspect of decriminalization can be able to address all those other ills?
Look, some of the issues that you've raised, in particular access to health care and the issue of HIV and AIDS, is something that government is already working with sex workers and their organizations on. So they form part of quite a key component of the South African National AIDS Council, and there are various government programs and policies, particularly with regard to people selling sex and their vulnerability to HIV and AIDS. So that's already done, or that's already in process. But yes, the problem that people selling sex have is that they want to go and report something to the police. They want to report that they were raped, that they were assaulted by their clients. They want to report that there are victims of trafficking around that are also being forced to sell sex. They can't do that without running the possibility of being arrested by the police.
How is this then, Deputy Minister, going to impact on other municipal bylaws in particular, which are directly, maybe even indirectly, applying to sex work in the country? For example, at municipal level, right? People are arrested for offences such as loitering, vagrancy, impeding on the flow of traffic, etc., etc.
Yeah, look, those are, as you say, those are municipal bylaws, and I think most of the problems that sex workers have with law enforcement is for breaking those bylaws, for selling sex on the street or soliciting on the street, and being then had up for charged with loitering, for things like that. Now that's a separate sphere. What we would be looking at is, in particular, the remaining sections of the criminal procedure. Sorry, not the Sexual Offences Act of 1957, an old 1957 Act, which still has some provisions in it relating to the sale of sex into brothels. And then I think it is Section 11 of the Sexual Offences Act, Criminal Law Sexual Offences Amendment Act of 2007, which criminalizes the buying of sex. The issues with local government would really have to be addressed by them. They're a separate sphere of government. In our discussions with, for example, with the Asijiki Coalition and Sweat, they had raised that really what they were after was the removal from the statute book of those crimes that I have mentioned, and they would then want to engage in the other aspects at a later point. Well, for starting, they're already engaging with it, but they would want the criminal sections repealed first, and then engagement on the relationship with local government, those kinds of things.
Are you expecting this to be hugely contested, maybe by some groups, by cultural activists, maybe even who are saying this, for example, Constitution does not take into consideration indigenous people who still uphold certain behavior and certain morals?
Yeah, it is a very controversial issue, and it is even within decriminalizing in some form. There's divisions between people wanting full decriminalization, people supporting, on the other hand, people supporting the so-called Nordic model, which is to continue criminalizing the buying of sex. And there's different policy positions on it. The Nordic model would be seeing the selling of sex as something that's bad, and through the model trying to reduce the demand for sex, for people wanting to buy sex. Then obviously you've got religious people who would oppose decriminalization in probably any form on religious grounds. And then, as you've said, traditionalists who would raise concerns about its place in traditional cultures. So yes, it will be quite hotly contested. I think from our side as government, I mean, the President spoke in the State of the Nation address, and okay, he wasn't referring to this aspect particularly, but he used the slogan of that we mustn't leave anyone behind. Currently, people selling sex are being left behind.
Yeah. And how do you, maybe that is the question, how do you bring everyone on board? Because there are some who are saying government is just ticking boxes with this exercise. They've made their decision. They're going to put this and pass this as law anyway. So it's just going through the motions with the Deputy Minister.
I don't think any public participation process is going through the motions, and this is only a small part of what's coming. So once we've finalized a position and put that position in a bill to cabinet, it will go out for public comment. and there'll be a period in which anyone can comment. I don't know if the department, that's done by the department. I don't know if there will be engagements on that. Physical meetings on that. After that process is completed and the comments have been considered, there will then be a final bill put to Cabinet, which will go to Parliament. Parliament constitutionally has to engage in public consultations, which would include public hearings if people want that, which I'm sure they will on this aspect. So there's a long process, it's not a box-ticking exercise. But it is an issue of, I think across the world there are different views. The issue for me, maybe just some pertinent points, are that we've decriminalized the sale of sex for, I think, ever. I think particularly with the colonial, the British administration, the Victorian period, it was really looked down upon. But yet it's still there. People are buying sex. People don't necessarily pay per transaction, but we've got the blessers phenomena in our society, where men are giving gifts to the blessers, giving gifts to women, and getting sex in return for it. Now, isn't that's not illegal, the way the law is phrased, but is that not very close to actually receiving some money for giving somebody sex?
Yeah.
So we've got to really look at all those contradictions. We've got to look at the reality of there's a large number of people, particularly women, but not just women, men, transgender people, who are selling sex, and they are extremely vulnerable. So it's also, we've got to look at what needs to be done to assist them.
Yeah.
And we've got the other aspect is high unemployment in South Africa, increasing unemployment. So it's not a simple issue of saying, people who want to make money from selling sex must go and get other work.
Would you say, those issues that you're raising, employment, the selling of sex that's been around since time immemorial, the blesser issue, those would be powerful motivators for the reform?
Sorry, I missed that. Those would be powerful?
Motivators for the reform of the law.
Yes. Well, I think the issue is, and I know that there are people in South Africa who don't want any change made to our law, but the bottom line is our law is not working.
Underpinning this, of course, is the question around human rights and making sure that people have got access to socio-economic opportunities and are able to advance. People would maybe even argue if we were making progress on that particular area, it would accelerate a lot of these issues that you are raising to be resolved.
Well, it's more acute in South Africa with high unemployment, and on a continent which is also suffering from unemployment, and many people are coming here from other parts of the continent looking for economic opportunities. So that is a big factor. As I'd said, the Nordic model is based on decreasing the demand for people wanting to buy sex, by criminalizing those people still. But it's an issue of the unemployment rate in the Nordic countries is much lower than in South Africa. So there would be questions of whether that would work in South Africa. But I think ultimately the issue is we've got to consider the human rights of the people selling sex, the sex workers. And how they are treated by other people, and the problem, as I'd raised earlier, of that many of them get treated extremely badly by their clients, get raped, get assaulted, are controlled by pimps who get them to get addicted to drugs so that they stay in the system, as it were, all those kinds of problems. So the human rights of particularly the sex workers is very important.
Yeah. The Deputy Justice Minister, John Jeffries, the department embarking on some consultative work with a group of bodies on the decriminalization of sex work. Currently, buying sex or selling of sexual services is criminalized in South Africa. And the view is that decriminalizing will address a number of areas: personal dignity, police abuse and violence. It will address the question of access to justice, safe working conditions, access to health services, and sex workers' risk for HIV will be reduced, as well as dealing with stigma and discrimination, among some of the reasons cited for the advancing of the reform of this law. Now, Deputy Minister, before the break, I mentioned that some views, of course, opposing this will be quite radical. Some of them would rather have Parliament, for example, act faster to come up with exit programs, because some are arguing that prostitution is never a choice, or sex work is never a choice. That's a PC word, but rather it's an instant of exploitation of women.
Yeah, well, I think the first point is I've spoken to sex workers, and look, I'm sure that there's many sex workers, but in terms of these engagements, who are very adamant that it is their choice, and they should have the right to choose what they do with their bodies. So that's the first element. I'm sure there are sex workers, people selling sex, who don't want to be doing it and are doing it because they've really got no other choice. But there are others who may prefer doing sex work than other kinds of work. But the bottom line is, I mean, you know, exit programs are good to give people the opportunity to look for other ways of earning a livelihood. The problem is we're in a country with a very high unemployment rate. And there's lots of money being spent on training, particularly for the younger people, through NSFAS, universities, technical vocational centers, things like that. But there's not that many jobs. So, and also with exit programs, there's the issue of the funding for it.
Yeah. How do you plan to accelerate that particular aspect of exit programs with that limited funding that we have, so that, as you put it, those who do want to exit at least have that choice, and they're not staying in sex work because they feel, well, there's no opportunity in South Africa, this is the only thing really I can do?
Yeah, look, one also has to be a bit careful that you don't have a situation where people say, well, I'm unemployed, I don't have a job, I don't have the skills to get any employment or to make any money, but I don't sell sex, but government is yet putting its resources into exit programs for people who are selling sex. So in other words, if I want to get onto if I want to get those skills, I've got to start selling sex to get access to access them. So we've got to be careful that that situation doesn't arise, because that obviously would be unfair. I think that also with exit programs, there's a lot that civil society can do to run such programs and to support such programs. So particularly those people who are so strongly opposed to the selling of sex, it would be good to see their involvement in these exit programs.
And the big question, which you and I have spoken about a number of times, is the question of trafficking, and in particular this time, sex trafficking. How does the decriminalization of sex work help us address that question?
Look, one of the reasons that the South African Law Reform Commission was opposed to decriminalization was because they were concerned that it would lead to an increase in human trafficking. And they based that on, I think, the Netherlands. I would need to look again at those statistics. But just to say that when we've raised this issue with sex workers, they have made the point that currently, if they are aware of sex workers who have been trafficked, who are doing this against their will, that they may be foreigners who've had their passports taken, or they may have pimps who are forcing them to sell sex. They make the point that currently, if they were to go and report that to the police, they may get arrested, so they won't go and report it. Whereas once, if selling of sex is decriminalized, then they would find it much easier to report it, and therefore it would be easier to detect victims of human trafficking. So that's a point that they raise. Effectively, the penalties for human trafficking and for sexual purposes or any purpose are quite severe. There is a specific provision of debt bondage being a part of human trafficking. So if you owe somebody money and you have to work for them without any freedom in that work to pay off that debt, and that happens, I think, to a lot of people selling sex, then that is debt bondage and would be classified as a form of human trafficking.
Yeah. What does your investigation, Deputy Minister, reveal around the argument that decriminalization will increase the population of sex workers in South Africa?
Look, it's, I think, a balance of that aspect versus the fact that at the moment, so you make it, if you decriminalize both the buying and the selling, if you decriminalize the selling of sex, it's the sex workers don't run the risk of getting arrested for selling sex. But continuing to criminalize the buying of sex does mean that they may need to take risks giving sex, selling sex to clients who are afraid of being arrested and therefore want to do the transaction or meet up or whatever in darkened places where the sex workers' lives are at risk. So it's a question of really, I think, balancing the conditions facing the sex workers, the people selling sex, versus the other factors of, yes, there may be an increase. It's something we would need to take into account and look at what has happened in other countries. But the issue that I'm very concerned about is the position of women selling sex who are extremely vulnerable to being murdered, being assaulted by their clients.
Deputy Minister, I appreciate your time and thank you very much for raising these issues with us tonight here on In Focus. That is Deputy Minister of Justice and Correctional Services.